this controversial piece of Canadian law is headed to the Supreme Court.
The notwithstanding clause.
The notwithstanding clause.
The notwithstanding clause is part of our Constitution.
The notwithstanding clause allows governments to pass laws that go against parts of the Charter of Rights and Freedoms. If you want to know more about it, check out our recent explainer. The notwithstanding clause used to be a pretty obscure piece of legislation. It was used a lot in Quebec in the 80s, but that's a whole other story. Outside of Quebec, it was only used 3 times until 2018. But since then, its use has exploded. Pause to read which laws it was used for. Now, a couple of these instances were struck down or overturned. But governments have also threatened to use it, like Doug Ford saying he'd use it to get rid of bike lanes in Toronto. And Alberta has invoked it this year to shield back-to-work legislation and 3 laws that affect trans youth.
It's become normalized in a way that I don't think the framers of the Charter really anticipated at the time. When the notwithstanding clause was threatened to be invoked, it really was an earthquake in society.
And it's being used differently than the people who wrote the Charter might have envisioned. Experts I spoke to said that when the Charter was created, the US Supreme Court was overturning things like labor laws and worker protections. So the clause was created with that in mind, as a way to protect rights provincially.
We can't have courts standing in the way of protective legislation intended to serve the interests of vulnerable workers, right?
But critics of some recent uses say they actually curtail charter rights, like Quebec's secularism law. Critics say it limits freedom of expression and religion, and particularly harms Muslim women.
The idea that governments are now using the notwithstanding clause in a way to target minorities and to be antagonistic towards charter rights is something that is quite new.
And when the clause is used, it shields the law from legal challenges based on the relevant charter rights. So what recourse do people have?
The notwithstanding clause is available for 5-year renewable periods that are meant to coincide with mandatory elections.
If the electorate gets really mad at a government for invoking the notwithstanding clause, they can punish them at the ballot box.
But that's not a guarantee. Minorities are, well, minorities. And some groups, say for example, trans youth under 18, can't even vote.
They don't have the voice to overturn these decisions at the ballot box. They have to persuade, right, their fellow citizens to reverse those decisions, and that might be hard to do.
Now, some say limiting the clause would basically be changing Canada's constitution. And some premiers argue that could undermine provincial sovereignty, which is the whole reason the clause is there. A case about the clause is headed to the Supreme Court. It hasn't heard a case about it since 1988, but now a hearing is tentatively scheduled for early 2026.